So this is my watercolour setup. So what I usually have is I have my paints, obviously. So this is a Winsor & Newton 24 professional paint set. Folds up nicely, so that includes obviously space to mix your colours and also the colours themselves. I also have a range of brushes that I use, so mainly you just need a large round, so this is a Daler Rowney number 10 round, and a smaller round with a fine point for detail, that is a number 3, and then a large brush so you can cover your paper with large washes, so that is a 1-inch flat brush. I've also got lots of other brushes here, but the main sort of 3 that you can do a lot of things with are those 3. I tend to use synthetic mostly. You obviously need some paper. I use minimum 300 GSM, so that's the thickness of the paper. Acid free so that it lasts longer and doesn't yellow over time. I use knot paper, so that is cold pressed, so NOT you might see it written as, and that gives a slight texture to the paper. I find that the most versatile paper to use. You also get rough paper and hot pressed, which is effectively ironed smooth paper, but I find the cold press, which is in between the two, much more versatile. I also always have a bit of paper towel to hand just in case I need to quickly dab something off there, soak up some of the water. I've also got an old tea towel that I use to dry off my paintbrush if there's too much water on there before I put it on the paper. I like using a tea towel because it's reusable obviously, and I can just dry that afterwards, and it saves me getting through as much paper towel. I've also got masking fluid, so you can get it in just a bottle that you use with a brush, but it tends to ruin the brush over time, so I like to use a masking fine liner. So that has a lid which has a lovely fine point on it, so you can get really precise details with that. So that is by Frisk, but you get a couple of different makes that make the masking fine liner. I always have a white gouache tube. So this is Winsor & Newton again, just in case there's any little white details or areas that I need to put back into the painting. I have some masking tape to tape my paper to my board. Pencil, just use an HB, and a rubber. I quite often use a putty rubber just to lighten up my drawing on my paper before I start applying the paint. Also, another thing that's handy for watercolour is a waterproof pen. So test out, even if it says waterproof on it like this one, always test your pen out, make sure it's dried completely before you then start applying watercolour over the top, because sometimes even if it says waterproof, it will start running once you get water on it, so really try those out first. I've got a couple of natural sponges here for different textures and different paint effects, so they're also useful. And I also have scraps of watercolour paper to test out my colours just before I put them onto my paper, so I'm always testing them out. And this is just where the binder was on the watercolour pad that I was using. Just pull it apart and get these little bits of paper out. They're still good to just sort of, do a bit of test work with the colour there. So I have a board as well, so this is just the back of an A3 watercolour pad that I'd finished, so it's still straight, so I can use this to tape my paper to keep it nice and flat, stop it from warping too much. You can also get boards that are foam boards, so this is a foam board here. They're quite cheap, you can get them large size and cut them up to shape. 2 water pots. So I have one for cleaning out my brushes, so that will become the dirty water, and then another water pot for my clean water. So that is for my brushes, and this is for me. So this is the clean water that I always take to mix into my colours to make sure that they're nice and bright and vibrant and don't get muddied during the mixing process. If I kept taking the same water that I was using to wash out my brushes, if I just used blue and I was trying to mix up a yellow, using blue water and yellow is going to end up in me putting green on the page rather than yellow, because watercolour paints are so transparent they will mix with the colour that's in your water. I also have to the side of me always, so when I got this set of watercolours, I put little swatches of each of these paints where they are on the set and just wrote down what the name was, just because a lot of people ask me what colours I'm using, just to remind me what they're called. But it's mainly just to see, so I can look, whatever colour I want to mix, I can look on here which colour I want to use, particularly these darker colours in this paint palette. It's really hard to look at these and know what they are, if they're browns, if they're blues, if they're greys. So putting them out in swatches on your paper will just help you to find the colour that you want to use. So I recommend doing that with whatever set of paint that you get, and just have that to hand. So I'm right-handed, so I set up my watercolours like this. So to my right hand I have my paints and my palette, my brushes and my tea towel above there, and then the water behind that. So you can just use old, yogurt pots, old soup pots, jars, whatever you've got to hand for your 2 water pots. And that way I can dip my brush in there, get some paint, put it on there, wash it out, and then just dab that on there. It's all ready to hand, and leave that on there. And everything's in the right place. If I want to grab this to the left of me to try out a paint colour, I can do that. So that's how I set up my watercolour setup. If you've got tubes of watercolour paint, so you can use an old plate that you don't want to use anymore. You can also get these plastic palettes, and watercolour is reusable, so I tend to leave it to dry on my palettes quite a lot. If you just add water, it will reactivate that and you can use that colour again. So you just put a palette there instead. I squeeze little amounts of my paint from the tubes into these smaller sections, and then I mix my colours in these larger sections. So you don't even necessarily need these all sort of to hand, they can be at the side, and just pop a little bit of each in these areas. Okay, so that is how I set my watercolours out, and that's for me as a right-handed person. So obviously if you're left-handed, pop your paints and your palette and your brushes and things on your left side there. And that is the basic kit that you need.